My name is Father John Hollowell, and I'm the pastor of All Saints Parish, and then St. Lawrence Parish in Lawrenceburg, Indiana, and St. Mary's in Aurora, Indiana, and St. Teresa Benedicta of the Cross in Bright, Indiana. I was ordained a priest on June 6th of 2009 for the Archdiocese of Indianapolis. In 2018, when the Cardinal McCarrick scandal broke out, Cardinal McCarrick was the guy that the Dallas Charter had put in charge of enforcing and making sure no priests harmed children anymore. And when in 2018 it was discovered that he was one of the greatest abusers of children and vulnerable adults, I think I was, and I think a lot of Catholics were kind of filled with outrage, and so I delivered that first weekend. Actually, the reading was from the prophet Ezekiel, "Woe to the shepherds," and I preached like a really strong homily, about Cardinal McCarrick and woe to the shepherds who scatter and mislead the flock, and then went on for a couple more weeks just preaching on it and kind of moving through the different stages of grief. I remember at one point, after a daily mass, about a month later, I just sat in the confessional crying. Luckily, no one came in because I was just kind of overwhelmed by it. So then about 3 months later, I actually just kind of made a prayer, Lord, if there's something that I can offer up for the victims of Catholic clergy sexual abuse, I would do that willingly. And about a month later, I had my first seizure from a brain tumor. I think one of the things that maybe non-Catholics don't, and some Catholics probably even fail to understand, they're like, why would you do that? But the Catholic Church has this really beautiful teaching that we can offer our sufferings up, and that will help the people who we are offering our sufferings up for, and it will also help ourselves. And that really comes from 1 Peter 2, verse 21 and 22. Christ suffered for us, leaving us an example that we should follow. And so basically what that says is Christ suffers for us, but we can suffer for other people. He left us that example so we can be suffering for other people. And that just as Christ's suffering brought us eternal life, our suffering can also help other people as well. And so I didn't know it was a seizure at the time. I was just kind of running on the treadmill in the rectory. And I just kind of got lightheaded, laid on the floor. The right side of my body kind of tremored. And then it went away. I was going to call 911, but then I was like, I felt totally fine when I sat up. And so I went over and showered and stuff. But then I went over and told the office staff, I'm like, hey, if anything happens today, here's what happened this morning. And nothing ever happened. But then about 6 months later, I was running outside again and it was really hot. And the same kind of thing happened. I could feel myself get lightheaded, lay down on the side of the road, and the right side of my body tremored for about a minute. And then I just got up and walked home. But then the third time it happened, I was actually running outside with my friend, Father Jonathan Meyer. And after that happened, he's like, you need to go see a doctor. So I did. And then it led to about a year later, I found myself at the Mayo Clinic. And on the feast day of Our Lady of Lourdes, I found out that it was a brain tumor. Had surgery on March 13th of 2020. And then 2 days later, COVID broke out. And so my neurosurgeon told me that it would take about 5 days for me to wake up and then another month of physical therapy. And so basically it did. And my only memories when I was waking up were the nurses coming in and telling my parents that the visiting hours were getting more and more restricted. So that was a really crazy time. But once I realized and heard that all the churches in the country were shut down, my immediate priority became having Mass for my people as quickly as possible. So I actually got to have Mass on the feast day of the Annunciation for the first time, and that was the parish that I was at, one of the parishes that I was at the time. And then started to celebrating Mass and praying the Rosary online, the Liturgy of the Hours, and all of that sorts of things. About 6 weeks after the first surgery, I started radiation, but then there was an infection, and then I had to go into an emergency surgery that day. And so so what they do, anytime you have a brain surgery, they have to cut the skull. And once they cut that skull, that part of the skull, then no blood can get into the skull anymore. And so if there is an infection from that first surgery, they have to go in and get rid of that part of the skull so that chemo or the antibiotics can get in there and work. And so I had an emergency surgery. They went back in, got rid of the part of the skull, and then I had they put an injection line into my heart, and so that I could go and get a daily antibiotic infusion for 6 weeks. And then I wore a helmet because that part of the skull wasn't there. And so then they did radiation again, and then they put me on chemo. And I tried to go and have mass again at my parishes, but it didn't work. And I just because of the side effects of the chemo, which were anxiety and depression and suicidal thoughts, which all three I had, particularly the anxiety and the depression, which I didn't even know you could have at the same time until I had them. But the Archdiocese granted me a medical leave of absence for 9 months. So I came back in the summer of 2021 and started having masses again, and I was getting an MRI every 3 months. And in the winter of 2022, I had a pretty grim MRI that showed that my tumor was starting to grow back, that spread to my pituitary gland, but I was now reduced to having to kind of preach off of a text. I was even struggling to read, whether it was the gospel or the text that I had prepared and all that sort of thing. And so I was perfectly fine to die, but I thought, well, I got the diagnosis on the feast day of Our Lady of Lourdes, and if I go to Lourdes and I'm healed there, that might help some people in my parish boundaries come back to the Catholic Church, and some people in my family come back to the Catholic Church. And so I went to Lourdes in the summer of 2022, June, to check off on June 6th, which was my anniversary of my ordination. The trip to Lourdes was totally chaotic and unplanned in a lot of ways. I don't speak a word of French and had no idea where I was going. So when I got off the plane in Paris, I just kind of found the train station on my own and just went to the train station and was like, ticket to Lourdes, and she didn't know what I was saying, and then I wrote it out. She's like, oh Lord, So I got in, but when I could see the shrine of Our Lady of Lourdes when the train was pulling into the station at Lourdes, but then I tried to walk there and I couldn't find it. The sun was starting to set, but eventually these really nice people helped me find it, and then I thought I made a reservation, but I didn't have that printed off, and so then there was a lot of trouble trying to even find a room. And so but basically I ended up finding a room there was a hostel basically for Lourdes, and so that was where I stayed. I stayed about 5 days. I was on my own and just didn't really have any plans or anything. I got to explore Lourdes a lot. I think if I had gone on a pilgrimage or something, I would not have probably had that much time in Lourdes, and so it was just kind of a beautiful thing. I did lots of holy hours in various churches around the city and stuff. And but yeah, so eventually I told my family, wanted to kind of know so that they could be praying when I went into the water at Lourdes. But then when I got to the place where the baths are, they said that they closed 15 minutes before the time that I told my family, and that they also required masks, which I didn't have a mask. So I had to run back to the hostel, grab a mask, and then get back in line. And so it was just totally rushed. When I got back there, I started taking my shirt off, but then they were like, no. And so they said, basically they showed me that the first pour, they pour water in your hands and you're supposed to just rub that together. And the second pour, you're supposed to drink that, so I did. And then the third pour, they showed me that I'm just supposed to rub on my head, and so I did that as well. And I figured if God wants to work a miracle, he can anyway. And but it was also just a beautiful trip. Yeah, it took me a while to realize I was healed there. There's not really any pain associated with a brain tumor, at least at the stage that it was. But people started telling me when I came back from Lourdes, I looked healthier, and I kind of started realizing that I was feeling better. There were some side effects from the pituitary tumor that I was having, and physical side effects, but then they stopped. And so I had actually an MRI only 2 weeks after I got back from Lourdes. And when I had that MRI, my oncologist said I didn't need to come back for 4 months. And I didn't think to really ask why, but when I came back 4 months later and he said, you don't need to come back for 7 months. It's like, why not? And so he said that the only thing that was showing up on the MRI was scar tissue from the original surgeries. And so, yeah, getting an MRI every 6 or 7 months now and feel totally fine. And I didn't have a particular devotion to Our Lady of Lourdes until that kind of all happened when I got diagnosed on the feast day. And yeah, I do now have a special devotion to Our Lady of Lourdes. Lourdes has about a 7-year miracle verification process where they have a lot of doctors. There's 5 or 6 doctors who are there full-time at Lourdes, and then they consult with other doctors. So I've been working with that team and submitting all the stuff that they want, and so I'm finishing up, I think, my first year with that. And yeah, so hopefully at some point they'll be declared a miracle. But yeah, so I feel totally 100% back to normal.